Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 823, and today is July 28th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Of course, we have a ton of news to get into on today's show, so I want to jump right into it. Just want to remind people to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, reposted on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcast. And of course, follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_, where not only can you find every episode of Conflicts of Interest, but also my other show, The Kyle Anzalone Show, and all the articles I write, whether it's for antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, or JudgeNap.com. Let's jump into today's news. The first story is one I wrote for the Institute on the 27th. Rubio says Maduro is not the president of Venezuela. Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared that the Venezuelan government is illegitimate. He wrote on X, Maduro is not the president of Venezuela, and his regime is not the legitimate government. Maduro is the head of the cartel de los Soles, a narco-terror organization which has taken possession of a country, and he is under indictment for pushing drugs into the United States. And so I think what we have here is an example of, kind of trying to bundle all the U.S. foreign policy talking points together in order to have an excuse to wage a regime change operation in Venezuela. Right? If we say it's a narco-terrorist organization, well then people who are concerned about the drug trade, people who are concerned about immigration, the border, people who are concerned about terrorism are all, instantly have their propaganda nodes in their brain triggered to support such a statement. Maduro is the ruler of Venezuela. It seems to me that his rule is somewhat legitimate. I mean, to say that I would like to live under Maduro's government would be an overstatement, but at the same time, our own government is fairly tyrannical, and so the fact that government abuses their own citizens and controls the economy is no excuse at all for advocating for the overthrow of that government. So last year, Maduro won re-election in the Venezuela presidential elections. The Joe Biden administration responded by asserting the election was stolen by Maduro and insisting that Edmundo Gonzalez was the rightful president. The State Department used analysis from the Carter Center as the basis for the rigging claim, when then Secretary of State Antony Blinken asserted the Carter administration is an independent organization, but it's really funded by the State Department, so we could see how this is all a part of the regime change operation. It was unclear whether President Donald Trump would continue the regime change effort in Caracas. In the first days of his second administration, Trump's crisis envoy Richard Grenell traveled to Caracas, met with Maduro, and returned with 6 Americans who are imprisoned in Venezuela. And so it seemed like we were really off on the right foot as far as this went, and maybe there was a real possibility that Marco Rubio would end up sidelined in the Trump administration, that he was just there to appease Trump's establishment base, and he was going to rely on his own personal envoys like Grenell, Witkoff, Adam Bowler to actually negotiate his foreign policy. And as we can see, Grenell is somebody who is not just a resounding hawk. I don't know if I call him a realist, but he's far closer to the realist camp than maybe anybody in the Trump administration other than Eldridge Colby, Tulsi Gabbard, J.D. Vance. And so this seemed to be a step in the right direction, but soon after, the White House adopted a more aggressive policy towards Venezuela. Rubio seized a plane owned by the Venezuelan government in February. Later that month, Trump announced the U.S. would step up its economic war on the South American nation. Rubio, who is also serving as Trump's national security advisor, is a longtime advocate of more American intervention in Latin America. Trump attempted to override Maduro during his first term. Then he backed Juan Guaido's claim that he was the rightful president of Venezuela. Trump also used maximum pressure sanctions in an effort to weaken the Venezuelan economy and Maduro's hold on power. However, Guaido never gained any popular support, and the Biden administration eventually abandoned him in favor of Gonzalez. But once again, Maduro seems to maintain all the public support, or the majority of the public support, making regime change just not something that could happen. My guess is that Trump isn't going to want to invest enough in Venezuela to actually overthrow the government, but is going to rely on sanctions to weaken the economy, hurt the Venezuelan people, and of course this creates more and more migrants that Donald Trump doesn't want coming to the United States, and so this is probably going to interfere with the president's immigration policy. Next up here, this article I wrote for the Institute on July 24th. Germany will only transfer a Patriot battery to Ukraine if U.S. sends replacement. So President Donald Trump's proposal for European countries to provide Ukraine with air defenses may run into an issue, as Germany is hesitant to send its Patriot battery to Kiev without a firm plan from Washington to give Berlin priority access to a replacement. In an interview with the German outlet Der Spiegel, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius explained that Berlin expects to replace any Patriot missile system it sends to Ukraine in 6 to 8 months. This is what he said. Our expectation is that NATO will then approach the U.S. again and make it clear to the manufacturer of the Patriot systems that the countries that are handing over their systems must be supplied with new systems within a few months. Pistorius said the pledge must be watertight, adding no major gaps are created that endanger our security and that of our allies. It's not just that the current operational capability of our air defenses is also about being able to conduct continuous training on Patriot systems, which requires a minimum number of systems. The issue with the demand is a shortage of Patriot batteries and interceptors. If Germany is given priority access to the Nets battery, it means other countries will be perched further down the wait list. Additionally, the U.S. is suffering from a shortage of Patriot interceptors, with the Pentagon estimating it only has 25% of the missiles it needs to carry out its own defense plans. Ukraine is in desperate need of air defense systems as Russia has stepped up missile and drone attacks. On Thursday, Russia reported striking over 130 targets across Ukraine. And so again, this is the issue with Trump's Ukraine policy. On the campaign trail, the president was right and accurately pointing out that the U.S. was spending far too much money on the proxy war in Ukraine that in reality was only going to escalate tensions between the U.S. and Russia and do nothing to improve the United States' geopolitical standing. However, since taking office, Trump seems really just focused on the fact that he doesn't want the U.S. spending any more money on this war, not necessarily that he doesn't want this war to continue. And the problem that the U.S. has isn't necessarily with the Treasury, it's within our arms depots, where the Biden administration really depleted our stockpiles of weapons, and combined with Israel's ongoing wars and genocide in the Middle East, has put a lot of strain on the U.S. Armory and our arms depots. And so the issue here isn't necessarily who's paying for these weapons to be sent to Ukraine, but merely that they're being sent is creating shortages in the United States. And so Trump, once again, seems to miss the mark and fail to really understand the problems facing America. All right, next up here, State Department approves 2 arms sales for Ukraine. The Donald Trump administration authorized 2 shipments of weapons for Ukraine, totaling over $300 million. According to the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, or the DSCA, the first sale is for Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and maintenance that is estimated to cost over $150 million. The second deal is for Hawk Phase 3 missile systems valued at $127 million. And actually, after I wrote this story for JudgeNap.com, the DSCA announced 2 more arms sales, I believe totaling over $600 million. So one important note here is that the DSCA says that The deal for the Bradleys will not require U.S. troops to deploy to Ukraine. However, the implementation of the proposed sale of the HOT systems will require temporary duty travel of an estimated 5 U.S. government and 15 contractor representatives to Ukraine. And so, of course, those people will be put in harm's way. The last part of this story I want to mention is it's unclear how these weapons are going to be paid for. Obviously, the Trump administration doesn't want to keep spending U.S. government dollars on the Patriot, on arms to Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine obviously doesn't have really any funding it's generating of its own, and so it's not going to be able to pay for these weapons, or if it does, it's likely going to only be because the U.S. or another country is sending Ukraine other funding that they're, is fungible. They free up some defense funding that way, or maybe the Europeans are paying for it. All that's unclear at this point. I did send a comment to a question to the State Department about this. I'm hoping to hear back sometime today to find out if the U.S. plans on paying for this, or they are expecting the Europeans, or maybe the funding to come through the mineral agreement or something like that. Last story up here related to the war in Ukraine. This one I wrote for the Institute on July 24th. Russia focused on creating buffer zones, eliminating military infrastructure in Ukraine. The Kremlin spokesman stated that Russia's goals in Ukraine remain unchanged following the third round of talks with Kiev, and a Russian official described the negotiations that occurred in those third round of talks as predictably difficult. So following Wednesday's talks, spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that's exactly why our armed forces are taking all necessary measures to establish buffer zones and, more importantly, to eliminate the military and paramilitary infrastructure of the Ukrainian regime. Turkey hosted negotiations and the two sides agreed to a prisoner swap. Overall, Moscow downplayed the success of the negotiations. So this was from a Russian lawmaker who is the chairman of the International Committee of the Duma, who said the third round of Russia-Ukrainian negotiations were predictably difficult and by far not merely technical. It was clear from the beginning that the sides will continue efforts towards a peace agreement without any breakthroughs. As Russia's chief negotiator, Vladimir Magnitsky, said, the positions of the sides are far from being close, but dialogue continues. Zelensky said the Ukrainian delegation proposed an unconditional ceasefire. Moscow has a long-standing refusal to a ceasefire unless a deal to end the war is nearly completed. Zelensky says Moscow's refusal of the ceasefire to lead to new sanctions on Ukraine. Of course, Russia is on an offensive. They're taking more territory. They're threatening major Ukrainian defensive positions at this point in time, close to taking important cities and towns in Ukraine. And so Russia is not going to allow Ukraine to have a ceasefire in time to rearm its soldiers, to fortify its defenses. It would be a strategic downside unless, of course, a deal is very close and, agreeing to the ceasefire would just facilitate ending the war. So, Zelensky wrote on X, Russia continues its terror and obstructs diplomacy, which is why it deserves full-scale sanctions response, as well as our strikes on their logistics, their military bases, and their military production facilities. So this is, I guess, kind of why I expected to come from the talks. It doesn't seem, as long as weapons are flowing to Ukraine, Zelensky is not going to feel the pressure needed to negotiate with Moscow, and that it's urgently needed for Ukraine to negotiate with Moscow, or else those negotiations will take place at the barrel of a Russian gun. Moving on to the war in Gaza, or the genocide in Gaza, I guess I should say. Israeli minister says Gaza will be wiped out and will become totally Jewish. So this was the Israeli heritage minister, and he made the remarks on Thursday saying the government is racing ahead for Gaza to be wiped out. Thank God we are wiping out this evil. We are pushing this population that has been educated on Mein Kampf. The minister is ahead of, or not ahead of, but is a member of Itmar Ben-Gvir's Jewish Power Party, and said that Gaza will be cleared for Jewish settlements, but Jewish towns wouldn't be fenced inside cantons, and explaining all Gaza will be Jewish. And so he's saying that it's not going to be as if there's, Jewish settlements in a Palestinian land. The Palestinians will be removed from the land, and then the Jews will move in. So very disturbing, but overall, this is exactly what we knew, and I'm sure this will just be added to the ICC or ICJ indictment charges against Israel. More of their ministers making it very clear that the goal of the Israeli policy in Gaza is genocide. Another one from Dave DeCamp here. 4 major news agencies warn Gaza staff face starvation due to the Israeli blockade. So 4 of the world's major news agencies have issued a rare joint statement warning that their journalists in Gaza are unable to feed themselves due to the U.S.-backed Israeli blockade as Palestinians continue to starve under the siege. So the letter signed by AFP, that's the France Newswire, the Associated Press, Reuters, and the BBC, all said, "We are desperately concerned for our journalists in Gaza who are increasingly unable to feed themselves and their families. For many months, these independent journalists have been the world's eyes and ears on the ground in Gaza. They are now facing the same dire circumstances as those they are covering." The news agencies added that the journalists endure many deprivations and hardships in war zones, and we are deeply alarmed that the threat of starvation is now one of them. The outlets urged the Israeli authorities to allow journalists in and out of Gaza, and it says it was essential that adequate food supplies reach the people of the Strip. On top of the starvation, journalists in Gaza continue to be targeted by the IDF. On Wednesday, a journalist who worked for local news outlets was killed along with her husband and 4 children. She was pregnant at the time she was killed, and the Gaza government media office said her death brought the total number of journalists killed by Israel since October 7, 2023 to 231. The statement from the news agencies came as Gaza's health ministry said another 2 Palestinians had starved to death over the previous 24-hour period, and that number has continued to climb. Well over 100 Palestinians have now starved to death, I think 80% of them children. Now, of course, some of those starving to death could be fed, particularly the infants, by a ship that was carrying baby formula to Gaza, but it was intercepted by the Israeli military. So this one for the Institute on July 27th. Israeli forces have seized an aid ship carrying baby formula to Gaza and arrested the crew. Infants have died of malnutrition in Gaza due to the Israeli siege. The Handala was attempting to break the Israeli siege when Israeli soldiers boarded it. So this is a statement from the Freedom Flotilla Coalition, which put the aid ship together, and it said, Israeli forces illegally boarded Handala in international waters, abducting 21 unarmed civilians. Demand your government end its complicity in the Israeli war crimes and ensure unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid, and call for the immediate release of the crew members. And you can see videos if you go to my article of the Israelis seizing the ship. Videos of the incident show heavily armed Israeli commandos arresting the crew. The Legal Rights Center, Adala, reports the ship was brought to Israel's Ashdod port. A statement said, after 12 hours at sea following the unlawful interception of the Handala, Israeli authorities confirmed the vessel's arrival at the Ashdod port. Despite repeated demands, Israeli authorities have also refused to allow lawyers to access the detained activists to provide legal consultation. Handala reiterates that the activists aboard the Handala were part of a peaceful humanitarian mission to break through Israel's illegal blockade on Gaza. The vessel was intercepted in international waters, and their detention constitutes a clear violation of international law. The Handala is a third Freedom Flotilla ship that Israel prevented from reaching Gaza this year. The first ship was attacked by an Israeli drone. The IDF boarded and seized the second ship, arresting the crew. The food aboard the Handala is desperately needed in Gaza. Felipe Lanzare, the head of UNRWA, the Palestinian UN aid agency, reports that 1 in 5 children in Gaza are now malnourished. And then Nick Menard, a British gastrointestinal surgeon who was recently in Gaza, explained the situation is dire for infants due to this formula shortage. It's terrible, the malnutrition. On the pediatric and intensive care, tend to care unit, the lack of food is dire. On the neonatal, there have been 4 premature babies who died in recent weeks purely because of malnutrition. Their mothers were too malnourished to breastfeed them, and there was no formula to give them. And he added that formula is being denied, saying that some of his American medical colleagues had brought formula to feed the babies into Gaza, but it was all confiscated at the border by the Israeli forces. And so, they're literally stealing the formula needed to feed the starving babies of Gaza. Absolutely sick and disgusting. All right, so one thing Israel is now doing is airdropping aid onto the Palestinians, and this left at least 11 Palestinians injured. So at least 11 Palestinians were injured by airdropped aid into Gaza. Tel Aviv claims that the airdrops are an act of humanitarian assistance, while aid agencies warn it will not reverse the mass starvation in the Strip. On Saturday, the Israeli military announced it had airdropped humanitarian aid into northern Gaza. Al Jazeera reports that 7 Palestinians were injured when large pallets of assistance landed on tents. Additionally, some of the airdrops landed far from where Palestinians are sheltering. Felipe Lanzare, the head of UNRWA, responded by warning that the airdropped aid can be dangerous. Gaza airdrops will not reverse the deepening starvation. They are expensive, inefficient, and can even kill the starving civilians. It is a distraction and a smokescreen. And so, to just explain a little bit more on how this could be deadly, in 2024, President Joe Biden led a group of nations in airdropping aid into Gaza. It was criticized by Palestinians and aid agencies at the time. The falling aid led to several deaths, including 5 people who were crushed to death during one incident. And so, there's really no way to alert the people that the aid is coming in. They're living in tents. And so if you drop the aid where the people are, there's a good chance that these pallets of aid that probably weigh dozens, if not hundreds of pounds, are going to be landing on or near civilian areas. At times we saw the parachutes malfunction or tangled together. And so then you essentially have 100 pounds or so, maybe even more, plummeting to the earth, not in any way being slowed down and landing on crumbling shelter, buildings that people are sheltering in, causing further collapses and killing people, landing on tents that will further kill people, or it could be deadly in 2 other ways. We saw some of the aid end up in the Mediterranean Sea before, and then Palestinians attempting to get it were getting tangled up in the parachutes and the cords on the parachute and ended up drowning to death. And additionally, aid that floats too far away from where the Palestinians are sheltering ends up in areas too close are deemed by the IDF as off limits to Palestinians, and so then Palestinians get sniped and killed by Israeli forces as they try to recover the aid. And so it's really just a sick and twisted way to attempt to feed people when there's thousands of trucks filled with aid just outside of Gaza that could feed them at any point in time. So the UN chief went on to argue that Gaza's hunger crisis is ending the solution to the Gaza's hunger crisis is ending the Israeli siege of Gaza and allowing international aid agencies to distribute assistance to the desperate people, explaining a man-made hunger can only be addressed by political will. Lift the siege, open the gates, and guarantee safe movements and dignified access to people in need. Allow the UN, including UNRWA and our partners, to operate at scale and without bureaucratic or political hurdles. At UNRWA, we had the equivalent of 6,000 trunks in Jordan and Egypt waiting for the green light to get into Gaza. So the hunger crisis in Gaza is so bad that journalists working with Western outlets are now starving. Children are starving to death. People are fainting in the streets. The reports from Gaza, from the humanitarian crisis, are absolutely horrific. Now, one of the things that Israel has used to justify the blockade and starving people to death is the claim that Hamas steals the food. And we can't let Hamas get the food because that's bad. And so we now had this report. USAID report finds no evidence of systemic theft of Gaza aid by Hamas. So I write this for JudgeNap.com. An analysis compiled by the bureau within the U.S. Agency for the International Development, or USAID, did not find evidence that assistance sent to Gaza was being stolen by Hamas. Israel has frequently said that it has to limit the amount of aid that allows into the Strip because it is stolen by militants. Reuters first reported the USAID assessment on Saturday, saying the analysis, which has not been previously reported, was conducted by a bureau within the USAID and completed in late June. It examined 156 incidents of theft or loss of U.S.-funded supplies reported by USA partner organizations between October 2023 and this May. It found no reports alleging Hamas benefited from the U.S.-funded supplies, according to a slide presentation of the findings seen by Reuters. So this is critical because it's debunking this key piece of Israeli propaganda. The problem is that Trump administration, the White House, they simply don't care, and they're going to continue to go along with it. This one, Dave DeCamp, July 27th, antiwar.com. Trump shows strong support for Israel as Palestinians in Gaza starve to death. President Donald Trump has shown strong support for Israel in recent days, while much of the world has been outraged over the images of Palestinians who are starving to death due to the U.S.-backed Israeli siege on Gaza. After the U.S. and Israel quit the ceasefire talks, Trump blamed the lack of progress on Hamas and suggested it was time for Israel to finish the job in Gaza. I think they want to die, and it's very, very bad, Trump said on Friday, referring to Hamas. For its part, Hamas has said that it was surprised by the U.S. and Israel quitting the truce talks and that it was committed to continuing the peace process until a deal was reached. In recent weeks, Trump has been claiming that a ceasefire deal was close, but now he is appearing to suggest that Israel should escalate its genocidal war, saying they're going to have to fight, they're going to have to clean it up, you're going to get rid of Hamas. Israeli officials told Axios that they weren't sure if Trump's comments were a negotiating tactic or a green light for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to use even more extreme measures. The report said that the Trump administration is rethinking its Gaza strategy, but there's no sign it's considering putting pressure on Israel to reach a ceasefire. Israeli officials also told Axios that the Trump has applied virtually no pressure on Netanyahu to end the slaughter in Gaza in recent months, saying in most calls and meetings, Trump told Bibi, do what you have to do in Gaza. In some cases, he even encouraged Netanyahu to go harder on Hamas. So while meeting with the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Scotland on Sunday, Trump was asked about the images of starving children in Gaza. The president said the people stealing the food, that people are stealing the food and, claiming Hamas, which, of course, we just went over, that had been debunked by his own agency, State Department agency there. All right, and so one more story on the aid situation in Gaza. This one again from Dave DeCamp on July 27th. U.S. Green Beret who worked for GHF witnessed the IDF commit war crimes in Gaza. So Anthony Aguilar, a retired U.S. Green Beret who worked as an armed contractor for the U.S. and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, has told the BBC that he witnessed the Israeli military commit war crimes against unarmed civilians during his time in Gaza. He said, I watched the IDF shooting at the crowds in Gaza. I witnessed the IDF forces firing a main gun tank round from Merkatov tank into a crowd of people, destroying a car of civilians that were simply driving away from the site. I witnessed mortar rounds being fired at crowds of people to keep them controlled, he said. The Army veteran went on to explain that other GHF contractors were not adequately trained. My professional opinion on how sites were established was that I would describe as amateur, inexperienced, untrained, no idea of how to conduct operations of this magnitude. That would be my most benign assessment, he said. In my most frank assessment, I would say that they're criminal. My entire career, I have never witnessed a level of brutality and use of indiscriminate and unnecessary force against the civilian population, an unarmed, starving population. I've never witnessed that in all the places I've been deployed to until I was in Gaza, at the hands of the IDF and U.S. contractors. When asked if he was a witness to war crimes, he said, without questions, I witnessed war crimes. I witnessed war crimes by the IDF, without a doubt, using artillery rounds, mortar rounds, firing tank rounds into armed civilians is a war crime. So since the IDF began operations at the end of May, more than 1,100 Palestinians have been killed while trying to reach the aid sites. The majority of those killed were near GHF sites, while others were killed trying to reach UN trucks. Aguilar's testimony aligns with eyewitness accounts of Palestinians who survived IDF attacks on aid seekers, and additionally, it lines up with a report from Haaretz, which spoke with IDF soldiers and officers about the Israeli policy, and they explained that that's what was going on. So next up here, Israel kills first responders in Gaza with double tap strikes. To ensure all those injured by the initial bombings die, the IDF is using double tap strikes that are killing civilians and rescue workers. Double tap strikes are a strategy used during the U.S. global war on terror. The policy calls for waiting several minutes after the first tribe to drop a second bomb on the same target. The policy left a large number of rescue workers and innocent civilians dead, who heroically rushed to the site of a bombing to attempt to rescue the wounded people crying for help. Additionally, those only injured by the first bombing often die in the second strike, or because rescue workers are fearful of attempting life-saving operations, as a second strike could happen at any time. So this was reported by Oscar-winning director and journalist Yuval Abraham, and he wrote it at 972 Magazine, an Israeli-based outlet. This is a quote from his article. Sources say the double tap procedure is usually employed during imprecise strikes when the army is unsure if it hit the intended target or whether the target was present at all. And so this is baffling, shocking, disgusting. He's saying that they're dropping second bombs on the target if they're not sure if the target, the intended target of the strike. So if you say a member of Hamas is in a house and you drop a bomb on that house, and then you say, well, we're not sure if that person was in the house, they drop another bomb on it. Now, maybe that's because they assume the member of Hamas will rush to his family and will try to save them, or, you know, whoever they claim, the alleged member of Hamas, I should say, rush to his family and kill the person that way. But of course, this means you're just killing innocent civilians, and at times when you're not even sure that there's a target to hit. So Abraham explains that thwarting the rescue of the wounded from beneath the rubble, moreover, means that target, if present, will still likely die either from injuries, from suffocation due to toxic gases, or from hunger and thirst. A source who was present in attack coordination rooms known as strike cells in the Israeli Army Southern Command, who witnessed double trap strikes, told 972, the military knows the practice is a death sentence for dozens and sometimes hundreds of wounded civilians trapped under the rubble, along with their would-be rescuers. According to the source, the secondary strikes he witnessed were carried out by the Air Force using drones without knowing who the victims were. They could have been Hamas rescue teams who came to assist senior targets, but could also be civil defense personnel, Red Crescent paramedics, or relatives and neighbors who are simply trying to save their loved ones. 972 reports that the tactic was deployed even days after the initial target was struck, killing family members attempting to retrieve their loved ones' remains. Abraham's article reveals other Israeli war crimes in Gaza, such as using toxic gas to kill anyone in the targeted area and the intentional targeting of schools. This was particularly sadistic. He said that the army established a special strike cell to systematically identify schools, which are referred to as centers of gravity, in order to bomb them, claiming that Hamas operatives hide among hundreds of civilians, he writes. And so Israel is intentionally, by policy, bombing schools in Gaza. Last up here, senior Iranian official, Tehran could leave the NPT if Europe reimposes sanctions. So a senior Iranian official explained that the Islamic Republic could leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty if Europeans move to reimpose UN sanctions on Tehran. Iran's deputy foreign minister told reporters that if the snapback sanctions were reimposed, Iran would retaliate, including potentially leaving the NPT. Under the treaty, non-nuclear weapon states agree to limit their nuclear programs to civilian purposes. Israel has an undeclared nuclear weapons program and is not a party to the NPT. Under the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, Tehran agreed to limit its civilian nuclear program in exchange for the removal of UN, US, and EU sanctions. A snapback mechanism was included in the deal that will allow those parties to reimpose the sanctions should Iran violate the agreement. However, President Donald Trump tore up the deal in 2018, withdrawing from the agreement and reimposing sanctions on Tehran, which had been found compliant with the JCPOA up until that point. Trump is now demanding that the European parties to the agreement, the UK, France, and Germany, trigger their snapback sanctions. The Iranian deputy minister is part of the Iranian team currently negotiating with the Europeans to prevent the renewed sanctions. While Tehran has previously threatened to withdraw from the NPT in response to Israeli or American aggression, the Iranian diplomat explained that he was quite confident that if the snapback was triggered, Iran would not show more restraint in this regard. He added that Tehran did not plan to develop nuclear weapons, saying, "Iran's policies have not changed after the aggression. We are even more determined to pursue our policies." So between April and June, the U.S. and Iran held 5 rounds of talks aimed at establishing a new nuclear agreement. Tehran reports that the new negotiations were making significant progress until Israel attacked Iran on June 13th, scuttling the 6 rounds of talks. The deputy minister said his country would resume dialogue tomorrow if Washington agreed to certain principles from the onset, but insisted that Iran would not give up its capacity to enrich uranium for its energy program. All right, everybody, that's where I'll wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Remember to head back to the Kyle Anzalone Show YouTube channel later today, 4:45 Eastern. I will have a new episode of that program, and talk to you then.